Hi, everyone. We'll give it just one more minute for people to join. All right. Hello, everybody. My name is Lauren Shelberg, and welcome to today's webinar hosted by GTHDNA in partnership with GoRapidDNA, our RapidDNA learning platform. While RapidDNA is well known in the context of law enforcement, today's session is about expanding the conversation because medical examiners play a critical and evolving role in the broader DNA ecosystem. From scene response and identified remains to decedent backlogs, the need for faster, integrated identification tools has never been more clear. Across the country, we're seeing new models of collaboration between medical examiners, law enforcement, and labs. And today's speakers are at the forefront of that work. We'll hear from 5 leaders in the field, each sharing what's working, what's next, and what partnerships make it possible. The format for today's webinar will be each presenter will speak for approximately 15 minutes. We will then have about 15 minutes for audience questions before closing at 1:30. And you can submit a question at any time during the webinar, and we'll do our best to answer them live. And if time runs short, we'll follow up after the event. And to submit a question, the chat box will be closed, so please post your questions in the Q&A box, which is located at the top of your screen. And your questions will be sent directly to the panel and will not be visible to other attendees. Thank you again for joining us, and please enjoy today's event. Our first speaker is Lisa Hurst. Lisa is the Director of North America for GTHDNA, where she has worked for over 25 years on forensic DNA public policy and legislation. Lisa will give us an overview of RapidDNA, a legal review, and federal funding options. Over to you, Lisa.
Thank you, Lauren. Pulling up my screen here. Yeah, so I'm going to go over today, just give you a high-level overview of RapidDNA, make sure we sort of set the stage and allow everyone to have the same understanding of the technology. A little bit of policy and funding at the end, so stay tuned to hear a few funding ideas. So what is RapidDNA? RapidDNA processes DNA samples in 90 minutes. And this is a big game changer for law enforcement. It's really designed for operation by non-laboratory personnel, meaning there's really a very minimal amount of non-technical training that goes into operation and use of these instruments, these RapidDNA instruments. They can be used in a laboratory, but they are also designed to be used outside of that laboratory environment. It does ultimately result in the same scientific the same DNA profiles. It uses the same scientific analysis methods as what you already get from your accredited crime laboratories or just your general accredited DNA processing laboratories. It's a self-contained desktop-sized instrument. We'll provide some pictures in a few minutes, and you'll see some, I'm sure, throughout this presentation of what a rapid DNA instrument looks like in its environment. But again, it has really been something that has energized a lot of interest in the law enforcement, but also in just the general identification community. It allows you to act on leads early within hours instead of waiting weeks or even months or sometimes years if your case isn't a priority. And it's a timely identification. Timely for law enforcement perspective, timely identification of suspects and potentially exonerations. But from a victim identification perspective, it's also a really timely identification of victims. It allows you timely notification of families and can really speed that entire process up. Before we get into some of the exciting parts about RAPID, I do want to make sure we go over a few knots of rapid DNA. Rapid DNA is not a replacement for traditional lab-based DNA analysis. It's not advised for complex caseworks. Again, that's why you're always going to want to have a continuing relationship. One of the reasons why you'll want a relationship with your crime laboratories or, again, your other DNA identification laboratories. It's not advised for things like mixtures. So in that case, especially sex assaults. It's not advised for degraded samples, things that are really old. And it's not recommended for touch DNA as well. You need a better DNA sample size. Also, at this point, we have not yet had the defense bar challenge rapid DNA results for admissibility in court. This is probably a little bit less important to the medical examiner community, but a lot of this need for court admissibility has been mitigated by recommendations from the FBI. And I think that these are recommendations that would absolutely apply to other victim identification processes. This idea of having an A swab and a B swab. So anytime you're using rapid DNA, you do want to make sure that you're not unintentionally consuming the entirety of your DNA samples in the rapid instrument, just in case you don't get a good result, in case something goes wrong. You always want another swab that can be sent to a laboratory for testing in that environment. So an A swab and a B swab, collecting two swabs from the same piece of evidence, or again, in this case, potentially the same victim human remains. And again, we'll probably repeat this throughout this present webinar today. The best rapid DNA programs are programs that absolutely are developed in coordination with partners at accredited DNA laboratories. Your state crime lab would be ideal. Local crime labs are ideal. Absolutely, there are accredited crime labs that are private crime labs. That's going to cost a little bit more money, but they're great crime labs. And there, you may also hear today a few instances of unique partnerships with universities where they have some DNA analysis expertise to help with some of that reach back on the back end when you don't get the type of result always that you need. So how does rapid DNA work? It's pretty simple. This is maybe a little bit oversimplified, but it's not much more than this. You get your DNA sample, your B swab, the A swab, again, should be, the best swab should be in a line, potentially for use at the crime lab or your accredited lab, your reachback lab, if needed. You put the sample into the cartridge. It's about a 5-minute process, maybe altogether. And documenting that sample, you insert the cartridge into the instrument. There's a 90-minute runtime. The instrument does count down that runtime for you, and the resulting DNA profile is the exact same type of profile that is generated by your DNA labs. These are CODIS eligible DNA profiles. In a simpler way, what the actual end user sees is not that bigger DNA profile. That profile is there, but it gets downloaded into a matching software so that you can use it to compare it to other samples. What the end user, the typical end user will see after inserting that DNA sample, again, you get the 90-minute countdown, and then you just get some quality flags. You might get a green flag or a check mark, a green check mark that says, that means that's a full DNA profile. No additional review is required. You're good to go with that DNA process. Occasionally, you may get a yellow check mark. Now, the yellow basically means that their DNA process worked, but additional data review may be needed. Maybe there was just an unusual characteristic of that DNA sample. Maybe something went a little bit haywire. Maybe there's an artifact or some contamination that needs to be looked at. That's where you want that reach back with your scientific crime laboratory or DNA laboratory to take a look at that sample before running any more samples again. They may be able to give you a thumbs up or a thumbs down to tell you to rework it or not. And then, of course, sometimes you do get that red X. This is usually due to some failure with the instrumentation or with the chemical kits, or sometimes you just have a really bad sample. And then, of course, if you have that red, that's when you would go ahead, again, use some reach back with your scientific lab and identify what the next steps will be. The lab will always know what the best next step will be. So this is what the instruments look like. Again, they produce the same type of DNA profile. If you want, we should be adding into either the chat box or the Q&A a link for this 3D tour. One of the vendors has this unique 3D tour, which is kind of fun if you want to use that website and kind of be able to see what an instrument really kind of looks like, how it fits on a desktop. And get a little bit of a better demo as to how it works. But again, they're both comparable in terms of the resulting profiles that come out. They're both good companies. They both have the Indus FBI approvals for the kits that they use that are out there now. And so you can check both of them out. One is Thermo Fisher, the Rapid Hit ID, and the other one is Andy. And I believe they call their instrument the Andy instrument. So a little history overview. Rapid DNA, as Rapid DNA first kind of came onto the scene, the ideal situation was for that really simple, known individual reference sample, a single source sample. We did several years ago, I think somewhere around 2019, the FBI set up guidelines for collecting DNA and searching DNA from arrestees if your state has an arrestee law, collecting those arrestee samples and searching those immediately against CODIS for quick hits. We do have 2 states, Louisiana and Florida, which have those types of systems already in place, and a number of additional states that are coming online or are working towards coming online with that system. But what law enforcement has been really excited about has been evidence, the ability to potentially test evidence within 90 minutes of collection from a crime scene, again, to either identify or, importantly, to exonerate suspects. Within that evidence world, we see a lot of direct comparison, so sort of what we would call a one-to-one. This is the most common use of rapid DNA. I think this is what you would also use largely in some of your disaster victim identification or other human remains identification. Again, it's streamlining that identification process. It puts DNA, instead of waiting months, years for a DNA analysis to complete, you're getting that within, potentially within 90 minutes, within a day or two, depending on how quickly you're running samples through the instrument. Some other things, uses with local law enforcement, we see some local databases. This is comparing their DNA samples to hundreds of thousands, maybe thousands of local suspects that get collected and databased locally in comparison against crime scenes. Some states have opened up their state database for comparison against the existing database of offenders that the state collects from. And new, and this is what's been the most exciting, I think, has been new regulations from the FBI guidelines to allow rapid DNA evidence searches of CODIS, of the National DNA Database, which currently has almost 26 million DNA profiles in it. So again, if we look back at the criminal justice applications, as all of these applications were sort of coming online, the original intent, I think the original idea was to use these applications for criminal justice purposes. But it became pretty clear pretty quickly that there's some great use of RAPID also from this decedent identification process. Family members, if you're talking about booking stations, these are reference samples. So your family members, samples directly from suspected victims or missing persons that you can either, again, hold locally. Those samples can also go into CODIS for that DNA database search. And with evidence now, with the new guidelines for CODIS, decedent ID for human remains. Human remains are considered a forensic sample for the purposes of searching the national DNA database. So with the new allowance for forensic samples within CODIS, this is also a door that's opening if instead of just testing things locally and maybe one-on-one, if you've got a bigger disaster, a bigger problem, access to that national DNA database could be really valuable. So again, you have this opportunity for direct matching as well as the kinship matching. So you may be able to test DNA from a medical sample or a personal item, a hairbrush, a toothbrush against an unidentified body, human remains. Or you can also build that pedigree tree, that family tree from biological relatives. These are all, I think, applications you'll hear about later today. So you can do that one-to-one matching just locally. You can also create your own local index. I mean, I think if you've got a little bit of a bigger event that's happened, you want to kind of have it locally, even if only temporarily, to match the samples against each other. And again, this CODIS upload really opens doors, especially if you may have instances where there are some far-flung samples with events on one side of the country, but existing family members on the other side. Rapid DNA is already in use at state and local law enforcement agencies throughout the country. About 40 of our 50 states already have Rapid in use in the state. So again, highly recommend, even as a starting point, reach out to your state lab, your local labs, see what sort of support or services they might be willing to provide to you when it comes to Rapid DNA. And lastly, I just want to cover how do we pay for it? This is a question that we get all the time. Sounds great. Maybe there's a lot of applications that you could see in your jurisdiction, but how do we pay for it? I would start off by just saying consider partnerships, especially if you're a medium to especially lower sized agency. Being able to share a Rapid DNA instrument with your law enforcement offices will sort of ensure that there's good use of that instrument, that you kind of keep the wheels greased and the system operational when you're not identifying remains. Law enforcement might be able to also help you offset some of those costs. And also consider regional sharing with other medical examiner or coroner's office. Maybe if your agency, again, is a smaller agency, there's certainly opportunities to band together with other offices. And you'll hear, again, later in these presentations today, opportunities where there were instruments around a state. And when an event happens, all of the instruments are mobile and can come into one place to kind of help law enforcement or your medical examiners or disaster recovery identify victims. A few of the federal grants that we would point you to, I think, there is a Department of Justice missing and unidentified human remains grants. We have not seen that for FY25 yet, but hoping that will come out again soon. And the other one I would really point you to is the Emergency Management and Preparedness Grant. DNA instruments are on the authorized equipment list for Homeland Security grants, and certainly victim identification is an allowable use under the recovery process for Homeland Security programs. There are instances of successful agencies in getting those grants. So those would be the big ones to look at. The other Homeland Security grants also really valuable. You may want a better partnership with law enforcement for some of those. And lastly, I would point you also to the federal earmark process. This has been a great opportunity for a lot of local law enforcement to get their own rapid DNA instruments. We have at least 70 right now around the country that have purchased instruments this way. This is a process that goes through your congressional office. Very successful. Members of Congress are really excited about this rapid technology. A lot of these applications do get selected. There's no match to these grants. You do have to go through the congressional process. It's relatively easy. The FY27 cycle, the applications actually will begin in February or March of next year. But the time to begin thinking about your application and getting things in motion will be this fall. And the folks here at GTH, Lauren and myself, would be more than happy to give anyone additional information on how that process works. If you're interested, just reach out to us. And that's the end of my talk.
Thank you, Lisa. Our next presenter is Lieutenant Jim Hawkins, who has been a law enforcement officer for over 20 years. Lieutenant Hawkins will be discussing his department's partnerships with coroners, medical officials, and the Indiana State Police Lab to develop expedited unidentified human remain identifications. Thanks for joining us, Lieutenant. Over to you.
Thank you. Appreciate you having me here today. Like most law enforcement agencies, when we got into rapid DNA, it was from the aspect of criminal forensic investigations. However, we quickly determined that there was additional potential out there for us to assist our local coroner's offices with identifying unidentified human remains. As it was mentioned earlier, partnerships are very important. We work closely with the Indiana State Police Lab. They've been a fantastic partner through our entire rapid DNA process. And by working with them initially, we were able to come up with the best way of utilizing the rapid DNA to help this Indiana State Police Lab by taking some of that casework off of them. It allows the state lab to stay focused on their mixture criminal conventional DNA cases and allows a faster turnaround time for the coroner's offices to be able to make positive identification on unidentified human remains. Typically, when we intake a case from an outside agency, I tell them if you can get the samples here by 10 a.m., we will generally have same day identification. But I'd say on a long end would be 24 hours if for some reason samples arrive late. It saves the state lab time, it saves the state lab money. And the nice thing about it is for the rapid DNA that we utilize at our agency, it doesn't consume your DNA sample, so you can always resubmit that for conventional DNA testing if you need to at a later date and time. The initial intake process is very simple. We have a form that the agencies fill out online. They submit it digitally. It gets accepted, and they create a appointment date and time all on the website. They bring their samples in after it's been approved for testing. The samples come in. They're intaked like any other piece of evidence to establish chain of custody. So whether it's a non-criminal or a criminal unidentified human remains case, it'll still have the same chain of custody as any piece of evidence that would come in. We do require consent forms to be signed for the next of kins because of the way our software uploads. We can remove a person's sample from the database after a profile has been developed. However, it will automatically get uploaded. So because of that, we do require that the contributing known does sign a consent sample that we keep in our records. So specifically when looking at the unidentified human remains, the next of kin sample, we would just generally use a buccal swab. Blood samples work really good if they've had limited exposure, if the body hasn't been down too terribly long. It can be hit or miss a little bit on decomps, but typically most burn victims will still have a significant amount of blood still inside them at the autopsy for us to be able to take some out and run a sample. We have had a lot of luck lately with teeth, specifically on decomps and severe burns where the body was essentially cremated and there just wasn't any soft tissue or blood remaining in the body. We've also had a lot of success with bones. Specifically, we'll take a femur sample of bones on decomp cases, extract a marrow sample from the femur bone, and we're able to develop profiles from the unknowns and then match them up to the knowns. And we just compare those with our rapid DNA computer. The nice thing is it's very user-friendly. So essentially, the coroner's office receives a very easy to read DNA report. You'll have all the information that you would normally have, but then you'll get a claimed relationship of parent-child or brother-sister, whatever the case may be. And then you get a probability ratio that typically comes back at 99.99. So some of the cases we've used these on, we used this on a murder-suicide. A husband had shot and killed his wife. The husband then killed himself. Unfortunately, visual identification wasn't going to be possible in this case for body IDs for the remains. They did have an infant child who luckily was not in the house at the time, was at a babysitter's. We were able to take blood samples from the deceased victim and suspect, and then buccal swabs from the infant, and we were able to utilize the rapid DNA to show a parent-child relationship and to be able to establish positive identification for the coroner's office. This next case was a single car crash. It occurred in Vigo County, which is about 2.5 hours northwest of Fishers, Indiana. I was contacted by the coroner's office. Indiana State University had 3 football players who were in a vehicle. Unfortunately, the vehicle crashed. Was fully engulfed. They knew who was in the vehicle. They just didn't know who was sitting where, and there was not enough for any kind of visual identification. They brought us in blood samples from the decedents, and then they brought us in buccal swabs from their next of kin, and we were able to match those up so they knew which remains belonged to which person. We had not too long ago a very unfortunate motorcycle crash on the interstate. It was very dark and rainy. The body, after it was initially hit by a vehicle, was ran over by multiple vehicles. There just wasn't much left. So obviously, due to the traumatic injuries, there was going to be no visual identification. There was nothing left resembling a fingerprint or dental. We were able to take blood samples from that and match it up to the next of kin. So just another example of utilizing that rapid DNA in order to make those body identifications quickly. So we partnered with the University of Indianapolis, Dr. Krista Latham. She does our reach back for the Fishers Police Department's rapid DNA program. On a side note, the university also goes down to the border states to do excavations of unidentified human remains at the border. While they were down there, they worked a case assisting out Webb County, Texas, where they had identified or they had located unidentified human remains, and their detectives had tracked down what they believed to be the mother of the decedent in Nicaragua. They didn't have the ability to do the DNA testing. So through their partnership with the University of Indianapolis and our partnership with them, they contacted Dr. Latham, who reached out to us and asked if we'd be willing to make the attempt to make the body identification for them, which we agreed to. They shipped us the samples. We were able to develop profiles from that, got a positive DNA match, and Texas was able to get those remains back to Nicaragua so that they could be released to the decedent's mother. So you guys know probably way much better than I do the importance of not making mistakes when it comes to positively identifying human remains. A county coroner's office had an unfortunate incident where they had done a visual identification to the next of kin who positively identified via photograph of the decedent. However, the next day, after it blew up on social media, the decedent walked into the coroner's office and says, why are all my friends telling me I'm dead? We were then contacted with samples from the live person that came in, the next of kin, and then also a blood sample from the autopsy of the decedent. And we were able to confirm that, in fact, the live person was related to the mother who identified the body, and that the decedent was not. It's kind of a black eye for corner offices. Mistakes will happen, but this is just an example of how utilizing this technology can allow you to avoid those types of incidents. So cost does come up. We do charge for services. We don't make any profit off of it. We charge for consumables and for the time it takes, the man hours that it takes in order to develop these profiles. Realistically, it comes out to about $228 per test to get one of these ran. It's a relatively small amount, I believe, for getting your positive identification back within a few hours. So it's just kind of thinking outside the box, working with these partnerships, working with other agencies, and being willing to try something new so that you don't leave yourself open to criticism. So where do you start with something like this? You reach out to the agencies that have Rapid DNA. We're all in this together. Even though we initially got this for criminal investigations, we are partners with our local coroner's office and coroner's offices throughout the state. We're all in this together. Another way would be to reach out to your local vendors. There's really only two to choose from, and I'm sure they would be happy to put you in contact with agencies who have Rapid DNA in your area. Local law enforcement, just ask. They're probably going to be very open to helping you out. We're all in this together. We're all working together to try and accomplish the mission. We value our partnerships with our coroner's offices, and I'm sure that any law enforcement agency near you would feel the same. Successes we've seen. So we began identifying human remains in 2022, and to date we've had over 50 unidentified human remains cases that we were able to close with Rapid DNA. Generally, like I said, we will have same day identifications, but we've had a lot of cases, burn victims, traumatic injuries, homicides, suicides, child deaths, and decomps that we've been able to make positive identifications on very quickly. So with all that, I want to thank everybody for spending some time with me today, and I will turn it back over.
Thank you, Lieutenant Hawkins. Next, we'll hear from Dr. Sterling McLaren. Dr. McLaren is an assistant medical examiner for the City and County of Denver, where she has worked for 5 years. She is also the Chief Medical Officer for the Department of Public Health, where she uses her expertise on death trends in Denver to help guide public health decisions making policy. Dr. McLaren will present on how Rapid DNA is used at the local medical examiner and coroner level. Thank you, Dr. McLaren, for joining us today. Over to you.
Thank you so much. Good morning. My talk will be very similar to what you just heard from Lieutenant Hawkins, and I'm here to give you an idea of how our office is using Rapid DNA. Just a disclaimer, I will be using some trade names because that's just easier to communicate that way, but I don't get paid or work for anybody specifically. And if you have questions about different manufacturers, I can't really answer those questions. Just a little bit of a background and introduction to our office. This is the Denver office of the medical examiner. We have just moved into a new building in 2017. So it's still pretty new and clean and shiny. This is our autopsy suite in the back, and down this hallway at the very end is where our lab is, where we have the Rapid DNA analyzer. This is just a view of inside the autopsy suite where we have our 5 stations that are movable. They can go up and down for proper height. We have OR level lights. We even have windows, so it's not a dark, scary place. And this is where we can do our work. Back in the end of the hallway here is where we have our evidence collection area. This is all secured under lock and key. And of course, our body cooler, we can house about 200 decedents at a time. In 2024, our death data looks like this. So it's complete. We had over 5,000 cases reported to us, and a little over 1,300 were medical examiner cases. Our jurisdiction is the city and county of Denver. That's about 700,000+ residents, and it's where the injury occurs. If the injury occurs in Denver, that's our case. We did about 800 autopsies and then a smattering of externals and chart reviews to complete those exams. We had about 483 drug-related cases. As everyone's heard, 2024, we had overdoses that were lower than the year before. Unfortunately, 2025 is looking like it's ramping right back up. So more stay tuned for that. And in Denver, we had 220 people experiencing homelessness who died. And I point that out because that is a potential for identification issues. If someone isn't a resident of Denver, it might be harder to find out who they are and their next of kin. But boastfully, 0 unidentified people remain in 2024. So how do we do it? In identification world, we have presumptive and positive ID. Positive ID is that scientific identification, fingerprints, dental, DNA. The presumptive is circumstantial usually, or by visual. Tattoos sometimes can help us with identifying missing persons and such. But we really want that positive, definitive identification to avoid the mishaps that Lieutenant Hawkins had mentioned. So in 2024, the means of identification in Denver, we identify most people by fingerprints. Some were visual and circumstantial, a few surgical and radiologic, comparison of antemortem and postmortem x-ray. We also have an x-ray in-house that we can use for our decedents. And then for DNA, we had 2 cases for Denver decedents that we did, but as you'll see soon, we also consult for DNA. So just to clarify, the identification that I said is best is the positive ID. We want that unique identifier to exclude others based on a comparison of antemortem and postmortem information. The gold standard there is fingerprints. Footprints might be useful, especially in babies. We can do a dental examination, DNA, and other unique features. And why rapid DNA? We, like I said, we identify most of our people by fingerprints because in Colorado, it's required to get a fingerprint taken for your driver's license. Some people have criminal records, immigration records, security clearance. So most people in our jurisdiction can be identified by fingerprints. However, we are also, the Denver airport is part of our jurisdiction as well. So that's a large international hub where people are coming and going from all over the place. So we may need to use DNA in that case. We also have a large tourist population, migrant population, people coming from other places to Denver and unfortunately dying here. And then we need a way to identify them if they don't have fingerprints. Also, the potential of having a mass casualty or mass fatality event, including the airport, those are also on our radar. So having the ability to use rapid DNA in-house would be really helpful in those scenarios. And it's also helpful, as previously stated, in burn bodies where the hands are involved and fingerprints no longer remain. Decomposition changes can preclude, as well as elderly. Some prints may be too poor for comparison. We've mentioned skeletal remains, and I'll show you an example of that. Babies or children of decedents, which you have to always be careful when using DNA with a parent-child relationship, not knowing what you may uncover for that family. We did have a case that uncovered some incest potential, and it got interesting. So just be aware of that. The benefits, we have it in-house. It's easy. You've heard it's 90 minutes. It's a quick and easy process. We can get results almost immediately instead of having to send out and wait and hope for help from another agency. And it produces a reliable positive identification that can be used for us to release bodies faster to the next of kin and get them closure and on their way. Some limitations, it can't, at this point, my understanding is we can't be uploaded into genealogy databases, so we can't have the benefit of that. And all specimens aren't going to work. Sometimes we have had failures when we've tried to grind up bone and put it in the cartridge. It's gotten too sticky or gunky and you don't have a good enough sample. So that's a limitation. And then again, the cartridges can be considered a bit expensive, around the $200 mark. And here we use the Thermo Fisher Rapid Analyzer. We got it on a grant from FEMA, and that was a grant proposal from our office written to secure that instrument. And we included the agreement that we would be a regional source for rapid DNA. So we receive consult or questionable cases from other counties. We can assist. Denver is a big city, but we're surrounded by a lot of rural areas as well. So being able to assist in people found in the mountains or out in a field and that other settings has been really helpful. And again, with the mass fatality resource. So this is the instrument that we use. It's about the size of a microwave. This is the cartridge, which is about half the size of a credit card, and the well on the top right is where you introduce the sample on a swab. And you'll see that in a minute. This is the actual analyzer in our office, in our lab, and where the cartridge gets plugged in, and the system that it communicates in the computer so that we can get the comparison. So for a case example, this came to us from El Paso County, which is just down south around Colorado Springs. And it was a skull found outside. And as you can see, it's just the top part of the skull and the mandible is missing. So they had a dental comparison or a dental consult who took x-rays and analyzed the skull and gathered the data. And then about a year later, a mandible was found in the same area. And the same dentist did an analysis on the mandible, but it was limited because parts of the mandible are missing. And you can see the matchup. It looks fairly good, and the dentist was fairly certain, but you don't want to say for sure if you don't know. So they contacted us for consult on a rapid DNA on this case. We extracted a molar, as that is the best sample with the DNA still around the root of the tooth. The molars are the best. Extracted the molar, crushed it up a bit, but not too much. Like I said, you don't want it too sandy and fine to clog up the analyzer. Swab the area, and that's the swab going into the cartridge there. A little closer up so you can see how it works. And then our lab supervisor entering the cartridge into the instrument. And bada bing, bada boom, with some magic, you get the answers. It was a perfect match between the mandible and the cranium. And so that case was able to be moved on as identified as one individual. And another case, so for skeletonized remains, we had this person, and we had an idea of who we thought they would be based on circumstances and where the body was found. And actually, to extract the DNA in this case, we didn't grind up anything. We have the thoracic spine here, sawed in half, and you can take a swab. What we did was just swab the area kind of all over and just ran it around everything in this area, introduced it into the cartridge, and we got a result. So we ran it with the potential child of this decedent, who was a woman, which kind of helps limit some of the confusion. There's always issues of adoption and incest and whatnot, but we did get a positive ID on that person through DNA here. And one other case where we were consulted, again, like I said, we do have a big airport in our jurisdiction, but there are small airports in the more rural areas surrounding. And most airport disasters, mishaps don't really happen at the airport, happen surrounding around the airport. This was an unfortunate case where someone had taken an airplane for a test drive with a friend and unfortunately did not end well. They were able to identify one of the remains with fingerprints, but the other was unidentifiable, other individual. And they had a brother. So they sent us the brother's buccal swab and the DNA from this unidentified individual. And lo and behold, we got a positive identification for them and we're able to send that out. So some take-home points are that rapid DNA is quick. It's really important to be able to identify individuals properly with scientific ID positively. So this is a really great tool for a medical examiner's office. And it also helps us bring closure to families faster and with more certainty that we have the right person in our care and that we can get them on their way to the right people afterwards. And that's really all I have. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. McLaren. We are now pleased to welcome Dr. Jason Bird. Jason is a board-certified forensic entomologist and diplomat of the American Board of Forensic Entomology. He is an instructor at the Florida State University and a medical legal investigator with the Disaster Mortuary Operational Response Team. Jason will give us an overview of the use of rapid DNA in disaster response. Dr. Bird, over to you.
Great, thank you very much. To share my screen. Hopefully everybody can see that. So I'm going to just talk about how rapid DNA was utilized in one of Florida's recent hurricanes. And we've used rapid DNA several times in other instances, but this was one of our first uses of it in the state. So Florida is somewhat unique in the fact that it has a district medical examiner system. There are now 25 districts in Florida that cover the entire state. And those districts are not under a centralized state medical examiner. They're all somewhat independent. There's administrative oversight by the Medical Examiner Commission. And to make things a little more complicated, many of these districts are ran by a municipality, a county. Some are ran by multiple counties, which makes the oversight a little more difficult. And then others are a private LLC or a private company, and essentially the county's contract with these medical examiner districts for services. So when you're looking statewide on disaster response and offering fatality services, Florida is a bit of a challenge because every district operates a bit different. You may be dealing with a public or private district, and they each have their own mass fatality plans. Although the state of Florida does have a state mass fatality plan, each district has their own plan for the nuances of things that you will find in their district. So Hurricane Ian hit in 2022. It impacted the southwestern portion of the state, which is very low-lying and heavily populated, as many of you probably know. The winds were up to 150 miles an hour, so it was a major hurricane, and it was approximately 500 miles wide. So it really impacted the entire peninsula of Florida. So for us in disaster response in Florida, we have to prepare in advance because we do not know exactly where that track will occur, if it's going to transect the state. And most of the state's mass fatality supplies is in the center of the state. So you don't want to have them too far north. You don't want to have them too far south. But if the hurricane track comes right through the center of the state, you have a problem because it's going to impact your disaster cache itself. So we tend to move equipment ahead of time. Move it out of the hurricane pathway and then bring it back in. So in this instance, these were our main challenges, some of the difficult to access low-lying barrier islands that are just out of Fort Myers and the Cape Coral area. We knew that those would be heavily impacted, and that's probably where our response would be. So we start looking at those medical examiner districts in that area, communicating with them far ahead of time, trying to decide what resources they have in their medical examiner district and what they may need. Some of them may already have a rapid DNA machine in-house. Others do not have rapid DNA, but they have rapid DNA with one or more law enforcement agencies in their county or in their jurisdiction. So some have an articulation agreement with law enforcement jurisdictions in their area where they will take those rapid DNA machines offline for use with law enforcement purposes. And then bring them online for at the medical examiner's direction for human identification purposes. And others will basically ask for a contract So the health and medical response for the state of Florida is ESF 8. So the county would have to contact Tallahassee, the state capital, our state EOC, and essentially make a request for rapid DNA. Then that ESF 8 desk would then look to see if Florida has a contract with a vendor. If they have existing contracts, they would implement that. And if they do not, then they would look to try to draft a contract pretty quickly for disaster response. And then there's the Florida Department of Emergency Management, who also has their own contract. So one state agency may work with the other one to see if the state of Florida has any contracts for this type of a resource. And we try to work that as quickly as we can to anticipate needs of the medical examiner. We knew this would be a highly impactful storm just because of the surge. The red areas would indicate complete inundation and almost no survivability if people stayed behind. So we had prepared for a very large number of deaths, and we were anticipating the use of rapid DNA even before landfall, and started to make some arrangements for that, particularly as searches were conducted on these barrier islands and remains were brought in. Medical examiner offices also are faced with a bit of a challenge because you don't know how many deaths will happen, but in a storm like this with such widespread impact, you may have a very large number of fatalities, but their recovery rate may be very slow. So that medical examiner's office may be able to keep pace even with a very large number of fatalities that would normally overwhelm them, simply because the body recovery rate would be smaller. So sometimes they need equipment, sometimes they need people, sometimes they need both. It's truly an unknown for hurricanes with such a wide area of impact. But one thing that was pretty certain for us, and you can see some of these pictures, I'll just click through relatively quickly. If people stayed behind and did not evacuate, it was going to be a non-survivable situation for them. And then with the amount of debris that had been moved around, we knew that search and rescue operations would be going quite slowly. So we knew that we had a bit of time to ramp up, but we certainly wanted to be prepared as these search and rescue teams made their way around these communities and were searching for any survivors or fatalities. So in summary, there were over 5,000 homes destroyed, 13,000 buildings, both commercial and private, sustained extreme structural damage. There were 1,100 rescues early on, so we knew that people did not get out of the area, unfortunately. So we were still anticipating very large numbers of fatalities. Fortunately, that didn't really pan out, but the resources that were brought to bear, the FBI came in, particularly with their postmortem fingerprint unit, was amazingly helpful in this one. The National Guard FSERT teams, fatality search and recovery teams, which for us are located up in Jacksonville, so they were brought into the area. Florida has their own mass fatality team, which is the Florida Emergency and Mortuary Operations Response System. And there are also a few disaster medical coalitions which have a fatality capacity and storage capacity for up to 150 to 200 deaths. So there is a great deal of mass fatality resources within the state. Outside of the Lee County area, which was the major impacted county, 20 law enforcement agencies were brought in. They brought in just over 530 additional personnel to assist. And the Lee County Sheriff's Office themselves had 600 of their employees out and about. So they were all doing recovery and rescue operations. Since it is a district medical examiner state and each district kind of operates independently, instead of going through the state, one corporation that has rapid DNA technology contacted that medical examiner's office and offered assistance of any type, whether that be training, instrumentation, just whatever they needed. That medical examiner accepted the assistance, and they brought in a representative to help because of the damage. They needed to get into Fort Lauderdale, or they needed to get into the Fort Myers area, but they had to fly into Fort Lauderdale, which, if you know Florida's geography, is on the opposite side of the state. So they brought in the representative, they brought in equipment and supplies necessary to be able to run that machine. And then they drove over, they crossed the state and went through the disaster area to be able to get to that medical examiner's office. So then they conducted just-in-time training, and they were on site for 3 days, and they trained medical examiner personnel and Lee County Sheriff's Office personnel, particularly their crime scene units, how to operate the instrumentation and make the collection. So the medical examiner's office and that law enforcement agency really worked hand in hand to be able to bring this type of technology to bear on this. So the things that were discussed is where was the instrument going to be located? We're going to try to use it out in the field. Just for a comparison, the Surfside building collapse. One of the initial discussions was to have one rapid DNA machine actually out at the disaster site, and then one rapid machine at the Victim Information Center, and then maybe one rapid machine back at the medical examiner's office. But it was determined that we would not use the machine actually beachside, but the DNA samples would be collected beachside. That worked for quite well in that environment early on, but the body recovery was slow. Tissue started to degrade. There was contamination from sand and salt water there as well. But so eventually that technology didn't work as well as it did early on. But it worked extremely well in those austere environments. The other thing is power for the machines. Usually not too much of a problem because even at a disaster site, you're able to generate power. They're not power hungry. So almost any small generator, small inverter generator will power the instrument quite well. And then you have to consider the non-sterile environment like we were just talking about, and some of the non-sterile equipment used by the medical examiner's office, and maybe their lack of autoclaves and so on and so forth in a disaster, or their time that it would need to be able to properly sterilize those if they're doing a rapid throughput event. Then for Florida, the condition of the remains were somewhat not good. As I've mentioned already, the saltwater exposure and all of the things that are in that marine environment, decomposition itself, and Florida's extreme heat and humidity during our summer. You will have a fully fleshed body down to a skeleton in 3.5 to 4 days. So you're working with skeletal material very quickly, bacterial and fungal growth, and some post-incident fires, just like we were dealing with the Surfside building collapse, and the burnt remains and the contamination from other industrial products from building collapses. So collection of family reference standards of those can start just as quickly as the family can be identified at the Family Assistance Center or Victim Information Center, which is why we always have one machine set up at the Victim Information Center. So that machine can be processing just as soon as the victim information packets are completed, and we can get samples. With the Surfside building collapse, so those samples were done. They were transported to a nearby hotel. And we were getting some results from those victim profiles from the rubble pile before the body ever got to the medical examiner's office, just due to transportation times and distance with Miami and South Florida traffic. But eventually, like I said, that was halted, and then the collections themselves were just done all at the medical examiner's office, just due to decomposition, fresh cuts being needed, having to go to bone samples for many. And then time not being quite as critical towards the end of that recovery as it was at the very beginning. So your labeling and how you're going to process your chain of custody, that's going to be specific to the institution or organization. Methods of collection, exactly what tissues you're going to use, that will be up to the circumstances of the event. We usually start with just cheek swabs, even on the fatalities, if the body is in good condition. Then move to fresh cuts of muscle, and then go to sectioning of bone. So that tends to change over time, and then for us, it's just the race against the clock for decomposition itself. So it was quite successful. There were 2 unidentified males that we certainly couldn't identify by any other remains out of Hurricane Ian. Fingerprints stuck out. There was no dental records. There were some bones. There were 2 samples per individual. Those were processed using rapid DNA, and 2 full profiles were developed. So it worked really well. We continued collecting family reference samples from missing persons reports. And then we got them both identified. And fortunately, the family also had some dental records of one of the victims, and were able to reconfirm that identification with forensic odontology. So we still certainly utilize fingerprints and forensic odontology. Our goal is to try to use as many sciences as possible to come up with an identification. So it is up to the medical examiner themselves since it's their jurisdiction, but usually even if we get one DNA hit, if there are fingerprints present or teeth present, then we keep going with those modalities to try to get additional confirmations as well. So 75 total deaths happened in Lee County as a result of the hurricane, far less than what we had anticipated and far less than what would be indicated by the photos of the disaster area and the populations on those barrier islands. So most people did heed the warning and get out. That is the only reason it prevented a truly mass fatality for South Florida. Due to the rate of recovery, that medical examiner district was able to handle the remains without a lot of external resources from any of the other disaster medical coalitions or the state team. So by most measures that we use to gauge it from here in Florida, this was an extreme success for us. And then because the equipment was set up and being processed in the area, there were some post-hurricane things to look at too. Later, after the hurricane and as the recovery was going on, some skeletal remains were recovered in a wooded environment. It was in the hurricane impacted area. So it's a question, were these remains not associated from the hurricane and in that environment prior, or is this a hurricane victim? And they had been out there into the environment for quite a while, exposed to sunlight, rain, salt water, sand erosion. So those remains were processed using the same rapid DNA setup that was used for all of the other hurricane victims. There's some of the actual specimens that were used to extract the samples from. And an eventual match was made from the mom's reference standard. So we're able to get an identification on that individual. So even being out in the hostile environment of South Florida, heat, humidity, salt water, rapid DNA did work on those bones in that environment. And then there was a missing person case that predated the hurricane impact that had been on file at the medical examiner's office. So they decided to try to utilize those for rapid DNA. And that missing persons case was actually resolved by the rapid DNA on that use as well. So we can use it during disasters. We can use it after disaster as recovery operations continue and skeletal remains are found, and can also use it in those districts to help resolve some of their previously unidentified cases as well. So it's been extremely useful for us in hurricane responses and building collapse, and we will keep using it as one of our primary modalities for human identification in the future, because we can use it at a disaster site, we can use it at victim information. The machines will communicate over a cellular network with each other to build an internal database, or we have our own somewhat private network that the state disaster team brings in and sets that up, and it communicates over that disaster network. The thing that we have found that is most difficult with the application of rapid DNA is just getting the genetic samples from the family members. They tend to have a question when you come at them with a swab because they think it's going to be entered in some database, and they lose control of it, and they don't know who's going to see that data, what it's going to be compared with. So we are very clear to the surviving family members that are trying to give genetic samples. This is just a closed database. It's not a law enforcement database. And it's just going to be used to compare the known population of the victims. And if there needs to be a wider comparison against other databases, then we get the proper consent forms to the family before we use them in any other sort of law enforcement activity when searching other databases. So usually, if you can convince them that it's a closed database going to be compared with DNA recovered from the victims against DNA that is from the family, they're much more at ease with providing their genetic samples than they are with any other modalities that we've tried. So that's it for me. Thank you, Lauren.
Thank you, Dr. Bird. Our final presenter is Dr. Mike Garvey. Dr. Garvey is the Executive Director of the Philadelphia Police Department Office of Forensic Science. He has over 25 years of forensic and public safety experience at the federal and local level. Dr. Garvey will provide a brief overview of the response and use of rapid DNA at the Philadelphia plane crash from January of this year. Dr. Garvey, over to you. I think you're on mute.
Well, I'll start that over since I'm on mute and no one heard a thing I said. So good afternoon, everyone. Happy to be here. You're all probably 4 presentations in. This is the last presentation. So we will try to wrap this up and also have some time for questions. So what we've already seen so far through the 4 great presentations is there are a lot of uses for rapid DNA. We clearly know that it's really a question of when, not really if, we're going to have a scene where there are going to be multiple casualties and there will be some real tough questions to answer on who was there. So during that process, there's a lot of people, there's a lot of agencies, everyone's going to go to the scene. And we know primarily throughout our country, the medical examiner coroner's office is the one responsible for identifying human remains. No one's questioning that. But what we know is at these scenes, there could be questions from a law enforcement perspective, from an NTSB perspective, if we're dealing with aircraft or trains. There's also going to be a perspective of oftentimes from the local crime laboratory or the law enforcement agency, who may be the primary place where DNA testing is actually performed. So what I'm going to do is walk through how we worked this partnership with a pretty large plane crash in January of 2025. So January 31st of 2025, this year, we had, some of you may have seen it, we had a plane crash in our city in a relatively large, congested shopping outside area with a main avenue that runs right down it. It's usually people driving constantly around 6 p.m. at night. So people leaving and coming from work. And, typically this would be a very congested area. And there would be people walking on the streets, driving on the streets, going in and out of the various stores. And on that night, what we basically encountered was this.
Medevac Med Service 056, contact Philly departure 123.8.
123.8, Mike Tango Sierra 056 Medevac. Thank you, good day.
Medevac Med Service 056, Northeast Tower, contact Philly 123.8. Medevac Med Service Northeast Tower. Medevac Med Service 056 Northeast Tower, you on frequency?
First to runway 24, what's going on down there?
Position 765, we have a lost aircraft. We're not exactly sure what happened, so we're trying to figure it out for now.
So you can picture around 6 p.m. that night, normal night, which I will basically put out there right now is it was a cold night. It was a rainy night. And I firmly feel that the coldness and the fact that it was rainy probably helped us drastically, or we would have been dealing with many more people. But that night, from that first moment, clearly a plane falls out of the air, crashes, houses are burning, stores are burning, cars are burning, and we really don't know what's going on at first. So the first thing we have to worry about doing is getting officers into the area, fire into the area, put out the fires, get people that need help, 27 people taken to get help. We quickly see that there's one person who is in a car who has been killed. And we then quickly also learn that this was a transport flight transporting a young child who had been in Philly for care. There were 6 people on board that flight. So now we know from the very beginning, we have 6 people on the aircraft, 1 killed in a car, but we have no idea how many victims we actually have right now because of the possibility of people walking down the street and other cars, things like that. So the first thing we do is take care of people there, cordon off the scene, which is about a quarter mile by a quarter mile, a very large scene, using hundreds of officers over 7 days to keep that scene under control. We also quickly really realized that while this is a plane crash and the NTSB has jurisdiction over the plane crash, the NTSB is primarily concerned with their primary responsibility, which is the plane. They're interested in plane parts. They're not interested in the rest of the scene. They're not interested in the large effort of recovering human remains from that scene, which again, about a quarter mile by quarter mile scene. We broke it up into 5 search zones. We, at the crime lab, we were the primary folks for the scene, working closely with our medical examiner's office. Why were we the primary? We were the primary because we have a large crime scene unit. We have the DNA capabilities. So therefore, we had the personnel to control and process that scene. But even with that said, we didn't have enough people to process that scene by ourselves. So again, partnership came into play. We partnered with our local medical examiner's office and other regional agencies so that we could go from a crime scene unit that I normally have of about 35 people, who also, by the way, had to work all of our other crime scenes, to about the 48 hours that we were working on it, about 150 people processing a crime scene. We also realized that we were going to have to deal with the human remains. So we broke the scene up, a relatively large scene. You can see this is the area for the mall. This is the primary area where the plane crashed. And these homes, several of them were burning, and human remains from the plane wound up over on these homes also. You can see the point where the plane struck. It surprisingly does not look like a large crater, but there were burnt cars, evidence items all over that whole scene. We had to question, obviously, how many victims do we have? Like I already said, we didn't know. We know we had at least 7. We didn't know anything else. So in talking to the mayor's comms, who we were having 2 times daily meetings and all comms directed through the mayor's comms office, we never wanted to put out how many people were killed because we did not know yet. We also had to make a choice. If you think back to 2001, there was a good paper written after that on in a large scene with multiple victims, you have a choice to make. Are you going to try to say, I want to ID every person, or I want to ID every human remains sample we recover? Our answer for that question was we are going to identify every human remains sample we recovered. 1, because these are people, we want to bring a closure. And 2, we had to, because we, once again, did not know how many people were actually there. We also immediately that night started to track every missing persons call that came in. We routed to 1 phone number so that if we came up with more than those 7 people, more than 7 DNA profiles, we would immediately be able to go to those missing persons cases to say, okay, let's start collecting family reference and do any DNA processing we have to do there. I also have to mention the plane was not from our country. So all of the coordination for the family reference samples for the 6 victims on the plane was coordinated through the Mexican consulate. I was on the phone with the Mexican consulate every day, talking about our progress, talking about what types of samples they should collect. This was a very organized chaos, right? We were basically at a scene processing it for 48 hours, doing a lot of collections, but a lot of communication also, communicating with our partners and everyone else. We fortunately, within the far end of that mall, there was an empty storefront, which we claimed immediately, and that was our human remains processing area. working with folks from our DNA unit and the medical examiner's office, all human remains samples, over 550 samples taken from the scene came there first, where they were logged in, and we collected DNA samples on site. So there would be medical tracking for going to the morgue, and there was OFS tracking for the DNA. We collected 3 samples from every human remain tissue that we had at that scene, 2 swabs and 1 small cutting. Swabs and cutting both from deeper into the tissue where it was cleaner. You can basically picture there was a lot of charring. There was a lot of jet fuel also. So we took 3 clean, basic items from every human sample we had. We also had to ask a question to ourselves, how are we going to do this? How are we going to process this all? And we quickly said all of this effort, all of the items from this scene were going to be worked by Rapid DNA. That was going to be our primary processing. If it didn't work in Rapid, we would go to our traditional DNA processing. And if we came up with unknown people from the scene, if we had to go to genealogy type work, we would do that last, but we were going to start with Rapid. We were going to keep our normal DNA lab up and running for our traditional criminal casework. We still had court cases, we still have crime going on, and we also realized that for these purposes, we were not putting out a laboratory report. We were putting out a formal report that had a technical review, but for the purposes of who were these individuals, not for a criminal case work. We have 3 rapid hit IDs. Within about 24 hours, it was about 48 hours maybe total, we had 16 instruments on site up and running. And the reason for that is because we had already talked about partnerships with a lot of different agencies. All of these agencies, including the company that makes the rapid hit, were absolute partners during this task. Within 2 days, we have 16 rapid hits on site processing. We ran over 547 items. About 20% of those were green. Profile came right out. About 80% of them were a qualified DNA person in our lab had to look at the data, but we were able to use it. So basically, we were able to use almost every sample we ran in Rapid, and we only required 6 of the samples to be run through traditional testing. This all occurred and was finished by Thursday morning. So it happened Friday night. We worked the scene for about 2 days, 48 hours. We had everything up and running on the first day of that next week. And then in 3 days ran everything and only had to do 6 through our normal processing. We also collected the references, right? Just like you normally would. We also typed personal items. Because we were dealing with such a harsh crash, we wanted to be able to give something back to the families. So where we could, we cleaned up personal items and tested those so they could be returned also. I can't emphasize enough how important this process of really remembering our reason, even for doing rapid, but make the ID is because these are people. Ultimately, what I can tell you is there were only 7 DNA profiles. There was no one else walking. There was no one else driving. We were able to, within 3 weeks, quite frankly, because we had to wait for the reference samples to come in, do all of this and make positive IDs for all of them. About 2 months later, 3 months later, we had one more victim who had been being treated for months. She passed. So we total lost 8 people, but we were incredibly fortunate that there were only 7 people on scene. And in terms of why this is so important from a people point of view, I'm going to share this, and then we're going to be closing up soon and going to questions and answers.
We're here at Philadelphia International Airport where the remains of the 6 victims aboard the medical jet that crashed in Northeast Philadelphia months ago will be repatriated and reunited with loved ones in Mexico City. I spoke to the consul of Mexico here in Philadelphia, who tells me that this is an important step in closure for these families. This is video of the procession this morning as a representative for the Mexican government in Philadelphia and his team transported the remains. Their urns were escorted from the Mexican consulate to a vehicle outside and then transported via police escort to the airport. 32-year-old Lisette Murillo Osuna and her 11-year-old daughter, Valentina Guzman Murillo, were making their way back home to Mexico on January 31st. Also on the plane, Dr. Raul Mesa Redondo, paramedic Rodrigo Lopez Paradilla, and Captain Alan Alejandro Montoya, along with co-pilot Josue de Jesus Juarez.
The authorities have kept us all the time informed about how the investigation is advancing, and so we appreciate it very much from our bottom of our heart, everything that has been done to bring some closure to the family.
So closure wasn't just critical for the people who were linked to the plane crash. Quite frankly, it also ties in with where I will start to close up right here is employee wellness also. Don't forget your people. They're processing these horrendous scenes, and having them be included in part of that process to return the people home, all of them said was incredibly, really touching for them, and it actually helped them process this crazy scene. So in closing, you are going to have it happen. Be prepared. Start planning for it now. Partner agencies are quite critical. Have people on site coordinating and wherever you're processing. And don't forget your people and plan for it, but realize that whatever you plan for, it's going to be a little different, but it's critically important. And I'll stop there and we can move on to Q&A.
Thank you, Dr. Garvey. So your first question can go to Dr. McLaren. And this question says, does the Denver Coroner's Office plan to publish or further report their findings with rapid DNA to the medical examiner and coroner community, especially interested in rapid's use for bones?
Hi, that's a great question. We currently don't have any plans, although we're under the Department of Public Health and Environment here, and we are working with their academic division to bolster some of our interaction with the public health school, public health. So I think there's opportunity there as well.
We have one for Lisa. Does the budget reconciliation legislation that passed Congress a few weeks ago have additional Department of Homeland Security money that could be used for rapid DNA to prepare for disaster response?
Sorry. There is a significant amount of additional funding in that big, beautiful bill for Homeland Security purposes, including some of those Homeland Security grants. I think a lot of the funding is really focused on immigration enforcement. So positioning your use of rapid DNA to include an immigration component, possibly identifying, especially if you're a border state, identifying migrants who maybe, don't make it to their destination. That sort of thing will be helpful, but definitely keep an eye on Homeland Security and funding coming out of that corner, because there was literally billions of dollars, extra dollars appropriated to Homeland Security.
Thank you, Lisa. This one is for Dr. Garvey. How reliable is rapid DNA with human remains and those exposed to disaster conditions? And when should it be used versus traditional lab analysis?
So great question. What we saw was in practically 99% of the items that we worked, we were able to get a profile. Now, realizing about 80% of those were profiles that needed to be looked at by a person that does that type of work, right? So it was not the sample in, profile out, but we were still able to use it. So 6 out of 547 items only had to be worked through our traditional testing. So it works.
Thank you, Dr. Garvey. This one is for Lieutenant Hawkins. What is the best way to collect DNA samples in the field, and who should be responsible for doing it?
So that's a good question. A lot of that would depend on, the nature of the scene itself. If we're talking specifically about unidentified human remains, we typically get our samples. They're typically collected by the pathologist at the autopsy. We've worked with our coroner's office on packaging and what's needed to best preserve the evidence, but it's generally collected at the autopsy. We can do evidence that's collected at the scene if there's blood collected at the scene, but if I'm doing an unidentified human remain, I would prefer getting my sample directly from the pathologist at the autopsy.
Thank you, Lieutenant Hawkins. This one is for Dr. Bird. What training or resources are available to help our agency prepare for DNA-based victim identification in a disaster?
Sure. Well, there are at least 2 Florida Disaster Medical Coalitions that do training in Florida each year. The Florida State team does training where we're using rapid DNA in real time from volunteers who donate their DNA. So that is available. And then, as I understand it, the most prominent vendors that are out there offer some training for rapid DNA around the country multiple times a year. So I would highly suggest that. But that said, the just-in-time training that has been brought in by some of the most popular vendors that we use here in Florida has worked very well. I try to avoid just-in-time training as much as possible, but the process works.
Thank you, Dr. Bird. Maybe Dr. McLaren can answer this one. For older skeletonized remains, would you say that breaking, cutting of the tooth or bone and taking a swab yield better results instead of inserting chips from the sample directly into the cartridge?
Good question. We've tried both and we have had better results with just swabbing that vertebral segment or kind of crushing that tooth and swabbing it as well. We've also tried slices of bone and marrow, and it's too chunky, too thick.
Thank you, Dr. McLaren. Well, that will wrap up our webinar for today. Thank you to all of our presenters and everyone who joined us today. If you posted a question in the Q&A or chat that wasn't answered, we will work with the panel to follow up later this week. And we also encourage you to visit www.gorapiddna.com, where you can find additional Rapid DNA policy and program information and updates. And we are also planning to post today's webinar on the Go Rapid DNA website if you would like to review it or share it with others in your office. Have a great day, everyone. Thank you.